Thank you very much, Professor Bernauer. In an email reacting to my lecture on the Jesuits of Jewish origins at the Jesuit Ritchie Institute in Macau in November 2007, a Jesuit told me briefly the story of his Jewish lineage. While the other Sephardic ancestors went to Istanbul, Baghdad, Tehran, and through the Silk Road up to Shanghai, when they remained Jewish until today, both his grandparents were descendants of Jews who settled in Palermo and Trabia in Sicily, where they converted to Catholicism in order to survive. In the baptismal registers, which are still extant, they are described as usurers. Yet, they kept practicing Judaism secretly. From Friday evening through Saturday evening, his grandfather would hide the image of baby Jesus from a large framed picture of Saint Anthony that he kept in his home. It was, in fact, a wind-up music box. On Fridays, he would wind up the mechanism and push a button so that Jesus would disappear out of Saint Anthony's arms, hidden in the upper frame of the picture. On Saturdays, he then would push the button again so that Jesus would come back out from hiding into Saint Anthony's arms. As eldest son in his family, my correspondent was told this story by his father, who passed away in 1979, who also had asked him to eat only kosher food. None of his siblings were required to do so. They in fact hide their origins since they are a devout practicing Catholic family. Had the Jesuit who wrote me this email asked to enter the Jesuit Order between 1593 and 1608, the Jewish ancestry would have constituted a legal impediment to his admission, just because his character would have been allegedly compromised by his impure blood, no matter how distant his Jewish ancestors were. Had he asked to become a Jesuit between 1608 and 1946, his background would have been reviewed up to the 5th generation, and the story of his heterodox paternal grandfather could, therefore, have been cited as reason to prevent him from entering the order. However, had he become a professed Jesuit between 1540 and 1593, no law would have prevented him from following his vocation, even though not every confrere would have supported it. My book tells the story of the evolution of the discriminatory concept of purity of blood, its complex nature, its magnitude in the early society of Jesus, and the role Christians of Jewish ancestry played in the order. Purity of blood, or pureza de sangre, was an obsessive concern that originated at mid-15th century Spain, based on the biased belief that the unfaithfulness of the deicide Jews not only had endured in those who converted to Catholicism, but also had been transmitted by blood to their descendants, regardless of their sincerity in professing the Christian faith. Consequently, the old Christians of pure blood considered new Christians impure and morally inadequate to be active members of their communities. As Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who died in New York City just a few weeks ago, put it eloquently, the traditional mistrust of the Jew as outsider now gave way to an even more alarming fear of the converso as insider. In the process of nation-state building in the early modern period, which was characterized unlike in 19th century Italy or Germany, by the national self-definition based on purity of lineage, the converso and Jewish elements, as figuratively epitomized in Shakespeare's unmiscegenated Belmont, became a particularly dangerous threat. Arguably, the high number of Jews who converted to Christianity as a result of the pogroms in the 14th and 15th centuries, and as a result of the royal edict of 1492, constituted much greater hindrance to the monarch's vision of Catholic national identity than they had during the Visigothic rule in Spain prior to the Muslim invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in 711. The first part of the title of my book, The Jesuit Order as a Synagogue of Jews, reflects the genealogical identification of the converted Jews and their descendants, no matter how distant, with the allegedly infidel ancestors. It was characteristic not only of some renowned Talmudic authorities and of the late medieval and early modern Christian authors, but also of some contemporary historians. Alfred Sickroff described this trend as the ulcer of the Spanish existence. It is telling that, for instance, the titles of both the anti-converso legislation at the San Antonio de Sigüenza College, Statutum contra Judeos from 1497, and the major contemporary work on Spanish conversos by Julio Caro Baroja, Los Judíos de la España Moderna y Contemporánea, published in 1961, so 500 years later, reflect the identification of conversos with Jews, even though after the expulsion of 1492 there were officially no Jews in Spain, as there were no Jews in Portugal after the expulsion in 1497. Caro Baroja, in fact, identified three different sources of the anti-Jewish bias: the economic, usury, the psychological, intelligence and arrogance, and the physical, body features and ungratefulness. A mixture of prejudices based on these features the conversos allegedly inherited by blood pervades the entire anti-converso literature, starting with the first purity of blood legislation in 1449, passed by the mayor of the city of Toledo in Castile, Pero de Sarmiento, to the Estatutos promulgated by the Archbishop of Toledo in 1547, Juan Martín Guijarro, better known as Silitheo, and to Bishop Diego de Simancas' Defensio Toletani Statuti, which was published in 1573. Like the gentle, but not Gentile, daughter of Shylock, Jessica, in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, in spite of canonical assurance of the regeneration through baptism, the converso was still considered a Jew in the eyes of Spanish Old Christians, and as such, he or she was constantly responsible for the faults of his or her Jewish ancestors. Two major intellectuals of 15th century Spain adamantly challenged in their works the discriminatory portrayal of the converso. Alonso de Santa Maria de Cartagena in the Defensorium Unitatis Christianae, and Alonso Oropesa in the Lumen ad Revelationem Gentium. Although some scholars pointed out that Fray Alonso de Oropesa's work represents one of the period's most important and carefully reasoned theological statements on the status of conversos in Christendom, Cartagena's work seems to have exercised even more influence in offering a distinctive Jewish converso soteriology. This is why I spotlight his Defensorium in chapter 1, without failing to know, however, its theological resemblance to Oropesa's Lumen, In the comprehensive template of arguments, both Defensorium and Lumen would become inspirational to many future efforts to defend the threatened status of conversos, including Jesuit conversos. Analyzing Cartagena's and Oropesa's works adds significance to the understanding of my argument for two reasons. First, Juan Alfonso de Polanco, one of the most influential converso Jesuits, descended from the converso Maluenda clan of Burgos, which was allied with the newly converted Santa Maria family through the marriage of Alfonso de Cartagena's paternal aunt, Maria Núñez, to Juan Garcés de Maluenda. Second, the Jesuit jurist García Girón de Alarcón, whose pro-converso treatise I examined in the last chapter, belonged to the same order as Oropesa, the Geronimites, before joining the Society of Jesus. The Geronimites were renowned for their openness to converso candidates and as such represented, in Sicrov's view, the Spanish pre-Erasmian movement. It is not unreasonable, therefore, to see connections between the Geronimite and Jesuit converso traditions, which, to the best of my knowledge, have passed unnoticed by historians, but which deserve to be treated in a separate monograph. Furthermore, the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius of Loyola, had many contacts with influential Erasmists and Alumbrados during his studies at Alcalá de Henares, as I show in chapter 2. Indeed, his positive approach to conversos and Jews predates the foundation of the Society of Jesus in 1540, despite the assertion of many experts to the contrary. His openness towards conversos may have been motivated by the financial support that he had sought from the network in Spain and in the Spanish Netherlands before founding the society, and that he would continue to seek as the Superior General of the Jesuits. In spite of this down-to-earth concern, Loyola undoubtedly was, as Henry Kamen powerfully put it, a deep and sincere spiritual Semite. The foundation of the Jesuits coincided, for better or worse, with the rise of the Spanish anti-converso hysteria that reached its peak in 1547, when the most authoritative expression of the purity of blood legislation, El Estatuto de Limpieza, was issued by the Inquisitor General of Spain and Archbishop of Toledo, Silitheo. Even though Pope Paul IV and Silitheo's former pupil, King Philip II, ratified the Archbishop's statutes in 1555 and 1556, respectively, in spite of the latter's earlier opposition to it, the authority and impetuous character of Archbishop Silitheo did not deter Ignatius of Loyola and his converso successor, Diego Laínez. Encouraged by their close converso collaborators, they vigorously opposed the Inquisitor's attempts to preclude conversos from joining the Jesuits. They also had to counter the Jesuit provincial superior in Spain and Loyola's relative, Antonio Arauz, who, abetted by his penitent, the Prince of Eboli, Luis Gomez de Silva, made himself the Jesuit harbinger of the Arbellian policy of blood purity. In a letter addressed to the Jesuit Francisco de Villanueva, Loyola straightforwardly wrote that in no way would the Jesuit constitutions accept the policy of the Archbishop, who, according to Loyola, should take care of his own business rather than interfering with the internal issues of the society. The problem was that the flourishing college at Alcalá de Henares, which was inaugurated by the Jesuit Villanueva in 1546 and became a mine of Jesuit converso vocations, was located within Silithio's diocesan jurisdiction. In this delicate affair, Loyola was aided by his plenipotentiary emissary, the converso Jeronimo Nadal, who visited the inquisitor in 1554. In communion with Loyola, Nadal insisted that the Jesuit constitutions did not discriminate between candidates of the society on the basis of lineage. Nadal, therefore, during his visit to Iberia, admitted a handful of converso candidates, and in a heated debate over the admission of one of them, Luis Santander, Nadal frankly and proudly replied, "We Jesuits take pleasure in admitting those of Jewish ancestry." The heated polemics over Inquisitor Silicio's legislation were still echoed 3 decades later in Bishop Diego de Simanca's Defensio Toledani Statuti, which was published in 1573, despite the fact that the Inquisition prohibited a year earlier further discussion on the purity of blood issue. This text, which publication date coincides with the Jesuit Third General Congregation, in which the anti- and pro-converso lobbies collided, is of special concern in my book. Not only because, in contrast to the early Jesuit leadership, it defended Inquisitor Silicio's statutes, but also became Simanca's tract may have been utilized by some Jesuits to promote similar anti-converso legislation in the Society of Jesus during the decade of fervent discriminatory propaganda that preceded General Congregation 5 in 1593. Indeed, a Jesuit from Toledo copied many excerpts from Bishop Simanca's book in 1591. They are preserved in the Jesuit archives in Rome, but until now have remained unnoticed because a Jesuit archivist inserted the manuscript, whose genre he did not recognize, into a folder containing documents related to the foundation of the Jesuit College at Toledo. These excerpts are analyzed in Chapter 1 for the first time. In the context of earlier anti-converso texts, they suggest the genealogy of modern racism, from Mayor Sarmiento to Inquisitor Silicio to Bishop Simancas to anti-converso Jesuit legislation, and they indicate the correlation between early modern institutional Catholicism and the new racism developing in Spain and spreading outwards. In this perspective, the anti-discrimination policy of the early Jesuit leadership constituted an act of bold and tenacious resistance to the early modern Iberian zeitgeist. As a result, the minority of Jesuits of Jewish ancestry socially and psychologically bonded one to another or dissociated from one another, shaped the history of the early Society of Jesus. They held the highest administrative offices, defined the society's institutional development and spirituality, revised Loyola's historiography by assigning it an inflated anti-Protestant character, filled the ranks of linguistically adroit missionaries in Asia and the Americas, authoritatively represented the society at the Council of Trent, significantly contributed to the transformation of the society into the first teaching order and to the placement of Greco-Roman culture in the center of the Jesuit school curriculum. Influenced by the Dominicans from the School of Salamanca, boldly offered a new epistemological frame to casuistry as a transition from medieval tutorism to modern probabilism, developed a new discipline of moral theology, and staffed the papal penitentiary office at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Some came from families who generously supported the work of the Society and the foundation of a number of Jesuit colleges. Others enthusiastically engaged in many other extraordinary literary, diplomatic and scientific endeavors. Especially popular among them were different missions dealing with heretics and schismatics. As the Jesuit Garcia Girón de Alarcón put it, by their sanctity and learning, they render the Society illustrious. On a much larger scale than the historian Marcel Bataillon has intuitively suggested, these contributions of Jesuits of Jewish ancestry helped to shape early modern Catholicism by complementing the work of their distinguished Iberian Converso fellows in the 16th century, such as Joan Luis Vives, Saint Juan de Avila, Luis de Granada, Santa Teresa of Avila, Benito Arias Montano, Luis de Leon, San Juan de la Cruz, and many others. However, after the death in 1572 of Francisco de Borja, born exactly 400 years ago, the grandson of Pope Alexander Borgia and the third superior general of the Society, a close-knit anti-converso party gained ground within the Society, as indicated by the archival material on the Italo-Portuguese sabotage of the election of Juan Alfonso de Polanco as Borja's successor during Third General Congregation in 1573, which I analyze in Chapter 3. Upon election as Vicar General, the Converso Polanco was the most prominent figure in the Society of Jesus. He had been a senior administrator in the General Curia in Rome since his appointment by Loyola in 1547 as Society Secretary. Because the previous two Vicars General, Lainez and Borja, had been elected Superiors General at the subsequent General Congregation, Polanco was considered the most probable candidate for this highest post in the Society. After all, to the dismay of the Italian Benedetto Palmio and the Portuguese, the Spanish electors dominated the congregation. They governed all but one Italian province, and the province of Portugal was also in their hands. Several Jesuit scholars have recently discussed this anti-Polanco campaign more critically. Some pointed out that the veiled attacks against Polanco for his Judeo-Christian ancestors were directed in reality against the Spanish nation. Others suggested that the distinction must be made between the anti-Spanish motivation of Italian Jesuits and the anti-converso opposition to the Portuguese group. However, the archival material that I examine in my book reveals that the real intention of both Italian and the Portuguese was to impede the election of Polanco or any other converso candidate. Spanish was a euphemism for Jew/converso, and the anti-Spanish campaign during the Third General Congregation was thus merely a camouflage for the Italo-Portuguese anti-converso conspiracy. In spite of the death of the anti-converso royal minister, Rui Gomes de Silva, and his Jesuit protege and confessor, Arauz, in 1573, the anti-converso lobby found support in the newly elected Superior General Everard Mercurian, who from the very first years of his office cleansed the house. He removed from Rome, and possibly from Italy or even Europe, almost all Spanish Jesuits, especially those who were accused of being part of the converso lobby. Ironically, Mercurian's segregation policy created new opportunities for some converso or pro-converso Jesuits who had occupied high-ranking positions in the Jesuit administration to reinvent themselves as prolific writers. 3 clear examples are Polanco, who spent the last years of his life composing the first multi-volume chronicle of the Society of Jesus, Nadal, who produced his monumental Evangelicae Historiae Imagines with 153 superb engravings, and especially Pedro de Ribadeneira, who in last 40 years of his long life composed an impressive number of writings on history, historiography, asceticism and politics, many of which were multi-edited and translated, assigning him a foremost place among the writers of the Spanish Golden Age, as I show in chapter 3. Arguably, the discriminatory policy of Mercurian, one that was subsequently endorsed also by the 4th Superior General Claudio Acquaviva, and the defeat of the Converso lobby during the General Congregation triggered the anti-Roman movement by Spanish Jesuits known as the Memorialistas. Contrary to what the closet Converso Ribadeneira argued, in an attempt to minimize the participation of his fellow Converso Jesuits in this movement, some members were indeed of Converso background. In an alleged plot against the Superior General in Rome, they sent secret memorials to the Spanish court, the Inquisition and the Holy See, asking for reform of the Jesuit Institute and especially for the autonomy of the Spanish Jesuit provinces. As in the case of the earlier Comunero movement in Spain, the vexed question of whether the participation of conversos in the Memorialistas movement gives it an exclusively converso character needs a more comprehensive and unprejudiced answer, which exceeds the scope of my book. The converso character of the Memorialistas movement was indeed accentuated by the anti-converso lobby within the Society of Jesus, which after the election of Acquaviva in 1581 included other high-ranking officials in the Jesuit Curia. Their Italian predecessor, Assistant General Benedetto Palmio, had fueled the anti-converso bias. It is evident in a manuscript that has remained virtually unknown for more than 400 years. Its critical edition is published in the appendix to my book. In it, Palmio relates how the multitude and insolence of Spanish conversos in the order had been growing and how the worms infested the apple. According to him, the first 2 superiors general, Ignatius of Loyola and Diego Lainez, had excluded conversos. But conversos subsequently had found refuge in Lainez's successor, Francisco de Borja. It was true that the Converso party had been defeated during the 3rd General Congregation in 1573, Palmio related, but they were insufficiently controlled by the newly elected Superior General Mercurian and consequently revolted against Rome under his successor Acquaviva. This and other documents by Acquaviva and his 3 assistants general that I critically scrutinize in chapter 3 undeniably reveal that these men orchestrated the discrimination of Christians of Jewish lineage into law at the 5th General Congregation in 1593 as punishment for the alleged participation of conversos in the revolt against their way of governing the society. Ironically, this congregation was convened because of pressure from 2 converso Jesuits, the famous missionary José de Acosta and the first Jesuit cardinal Francisco de Toledo. There is no doubt, however, that the 1593 decree proclaiming the Jewish and by extension Muslim ancestry, no matter how distant, was an insurmountable impediment for admission to the society, ignored Loyola's desires as expressed in the Jesuit constitutions, and contradicted the practice of the first three generalates. The lineage hunting season began. The measure, which was voted for by all but 2 delegates, was so harsh that it scandalized even the Cardinal Archbishop of Toledo and Inquisitor General Gaspar de Quiroga, who affirmed that the society dishonored itself by promulgating such a law. Indeed, Quiroga, who held the reins of the Spanish Inquisition between 1573 and 1594, during the bout of the most intense Jesuit anti-convert offensive, restricted the employment of purity of blood laws, a policy that reflected a shift in the approach of Philip II's council to the converso problem in the last decades of the 16th century. As a matter of fact, the Jesuit Sixth General Congregation mitigated the 1593 decree in 1608, if only superficially, because of the strong opposition from many Jesuits led by the famous Antonio Possevino, Pedro de Ribadeneira, and Juan de Mariana. These men's writings against discrimination and in defense of the indispensable minority of Jesuits of Jewish ancestry are analyzed in chapter 4 of my book. Amid other arguments, Possevino would point out that discrimination against conversos had ramifications for the relationship with aboriginal peoples with whom the Jesuits work as missionaries. Apparently, the Church at large became aware of the problem, as the canonical quotation of the Benedictine bishop Prudencio de Sandoval from his Vida y Hechos del Emperador Carlo V shows. And I quote, "I do not censure the Christian compassion, which embraces all. Then I would be in mortal error. And I know that the divine presence there is no distinction between Gentile and Jew, because one alone is the Lord of all. Yet, who can deny that in the descendants of the Jews there persists and endures the evil inclination of the ancient ingratitude and lack of understanding, just as in the Negroes there persists the inseparable quality of their blackness. For if the latter should unite themselves 1,000 times with white women, the children are born with the dark color of the father. Similarly, it is not enough for the Jew to be 3 parts aristocrat or old Christian, for one family line alone defiles and corrupts him." End of quote. Even though there is an obvious semantic difference of the early modern Spanish term of race or raza, it cannot be utterly dissociated with modern races and anti-Semitism. Racial tensions played a pivotal role in early Jesuit history, to which many manuscript sources that I examine in my book unequivocally testify. Nonetheless, the battle within the order against those Jesuits with Jewish ancestry has been insufficiently acknowledged and has been even suppressed in scholarship on the subject. Until my work, there has been no sustained systematic analysis of the correlation between the rise of the Society of Jesus and that of purity of blood mania in the 16th century, and no analysis of how implementation of the purity of blood laws had different stages in early Jesuit history. My book aims to fill the gaps of scholarship on the subject in 2 ways: by a different reading of the sources and secondary literature already known, and by an analysis of the archival material that has been known little or not at all. The clarification of blind spots in early Jesuit history that I attempt on the pages of the Jesuit Order as a Synagogue of Jews may well shed light on other discriminatory problems, like those so dramatically embodied in the meandering Shakespearean characters not only of Shylock and Jessica, but also of Antonio, with which the Jesuit Order grapples to this very day. Thank you very much.